I feel like I have to say this is off the cuff because it is. I thought about it somewhat, but I want to play a clip from this gentleman's. He's largely focused on the disagreements with Hebrew roots, and I'm in an interesting position as a Seventh Day Adventist because there's different people within Adventism that you could say identify more with Protestant Christianity, and then there's sections of or individuals who, scholars and lay people, who identify a little more with Hebrew roots or Messianic stuff, and it's kind of a mixed bag. As far as the theology, it's really middle of the road in a lot of ways because we make similar arguments on both sides. So it's kind of a middle ground to some degree. In other words, Adventists traditionally don't keep the feasts, as in, so we agree with Mr. Solberg, or Dr. Solberg, I'm not sure, with that it is not a sin to not keep the law of Moses in its entirety. So we would emphasize the new covenant is, well, we would say it's more like a renewed covenant when we're talking to Christians, and it's a new covenant, and the differences are emphasized if we're talking to a Hebrew roots advocate or someone who thinks it's a sin to keep, it's a sin to fail to keep the feast, let's say. So it's an interesting position difference. So many of the things Mr. Solberg would argue against the Hebrew roots, I would take some umbrance with, I guess, or I would disagree with him. But some of the things he talks about with the Hebrew roots, I tend to agree with. So it's weird. I think he was on Answering Adventism, so we do disagree about the weekly Sabbath. He would include that as a law of Moses. And of course, we know it was only issued as a command to the Israelites in a covenant. And so one of the better arguments against my position or against the Adventist position would be, and people have written about this and we have answers for it, which I'll give briefly, but nowhere in Genesis is there a command or a documentation of anyone before Sinai or before the Passover, let's say, before Exodus 16, anyone keeping the weekly Sabbath. So there you have it. But then one might say, well, there was never a law, do not murder. But common sense and the text suggest, of course it was a sin. God tells Cain, sin crouches at the door, and it was a sin when he murdered his brother. Or you can point to Joseph in Egypt when he is confronted with the sexual desire of Potiphar's wife, and he tells her, he ends his rebuke with, I will not sin against God by committing adultery. He literally says sin against God and uses the term adultery in English, of course. I haven't looked at the Hebrew there, but I'm sure it's related to the same sort of language as stated in the Ten Commandments. So you could argue that it's not the Ten Commandments per se given in the covenant, codified, that is why we obey those laws, but because they pre-existed Sinai. I think that probably is the proper way to say it. Why? Well, because of Hebrews 9:10, Colossians 2, and Galatians. It seems like Paul is certainly making a distinction between the law as a covenant. The new covenant is new. The old has passed away. So it is a new covenant. The question is, what would be passed along? That's the big question. What by necessity are we obliged to do or not? So here's my argument for Mr. Solberg, and I'm going to play this here because he's responding to that sort of what I've been talking about, argument from a Hebrew roots teacher. And I tend to agree with Solberg on some of this because I don't think it's a sin, like I said, to not keep the Passover per se. But I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but that's his position as well. So I want to point out, so my train of thought here is going to be, if I follow his own argument, making that distinction, that it's not because of it's in the law of Moses that Christians are obliged to do it, which is essentially what the Hebrew roots position is. Although I think even they will say, it would be the extreme position in the Hebrew roots that would say all the sacrifices are going to be reinstituted, or that we need to keep them if we could. I would differ with that, because it seems to me the book of Hebrews is completely clear that it's a change of the priesthood to Melchizedek, to what kind of priesthood God had in the world instituted before the Sinai covenant. And so, but most Hebrew roots would, only the extreme position would say implicate it, or suggest that we need to do sacrifices and such. And certainly they all agree. I've never met one that was still a believer in Messiah that said we should keep the Day of Atonement or do the atonement sacrifice if we could. That would be a rejection of the Messiah. That certainly would. So is that not a modification to the law? So I think everybody logically has to accept some modification to what is to be performed. Seems like that's what the ordinances that were against us are. Not against us like God didn't want us to do them, but that they couldn't take away sin in the way that Christ does. And so he is speaking of those things which they did that were unable to deal with sin in a permanent fashion, or the stain of sin, or the ultimate result of sin. So, but I want to listen to what he's arguing here and then make some comments of application regarding the weekly Sabbath, according to Dr. Solberg's. I think I'll just assume he's a doctor since he's a theologian and a teacher, a professor. So what he is, if I follow his train of thinking here and then apply that to the weekly Sabbath, it seems like his argument for not keeping the weekly Sabbath on the seventh day, I'm not sure if he's a Sabbatarian or not. That is, that we're obligated to keep a Sabbath or not. I suspect he is not, but I'm not certain. And he certainly doesn't say it's wrong to do so. He just doesn't think it's a sin to not keep a Sabbath, or at least the Seventh Day Sabbath. So like I said, I'm not sure if he's a Sabbatarian. I don't think he is. In other words, I think his arguing here regarding the laws for the native born, which is what this video is about, the native born and the foreigner. So let's listen and I'll make my point then. Hopefully I have it at a good starting point here. But you can see the text that he's focused on in his response to the Hebrew roots teacher.
Israelites and strangers are under the law of Moses? No. First of all, this verse comes while Israel was still in slavery in Egypt and before the law of Moses was even given. This passage in Exodus 12, which runs from verses 43 through 49, is about the Passover, the events that immediately preceded Israel's dramatic escape out of Egypt. And the same law mentioned in verse 49 refers to the command that anyone who participates in the Passover meal must be circumcised, whether foreigner or native born. That's the law that applied to both. It was about being circumcised before eating the Passover meal, not the entire law of Moses, which again, hadn't even been given at this point. And in that video, I also provide some specific examples of how Gentiles in Israel weren't subject to the same laws that the Israelites were. For example, Deuteronomy 14 shows that the sojourner wasn't given the same dietary restrictions as the Israelite. God tells Israel, "You shall not eat anything that has died naturally. You may give it to the sojourner who's within your towns that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God." So obviously sojourners were allowed to eat things that the Israelites weren't. And there are more examples like this, but I don't want to rehash all that since that's covered in my other video. But there's one other issue to mention here regarding Michael's comment. He says this.
Sojourner, and the word there is the ger, the one that's actually coming into the house of Israel. So he no longer is what he used to be.
What about this idea that the foreigner living with Israel is no longer what he used to be? Now, Michael doesn't explain what he means by that, but again, taken at face value, that's not a biblical idea. In fact, in the Torah, members of other nation, and the Hebrew word is ger, as Michael pointed out, The ger who travel or Israel are consistently referred to as strangers, foreigners, sojourners. They're always ger. They're always spoken of as distinct from the native Israelites.
I want to make a side comment here about this. Hopefully I won't get too sidetracked, but yes and no here. It is a biblical idea that when you come into the covenant of God, whether old or new, that you are a new creature. You're not of the world. You're in the world, but not of the world. So it's kind of like when Paul says there's one new man. There's neither Jew nor Greek. And the way people argue on either side for their case is hilarious to me because it's both. You are no longer what you used to be. You are a new creation. You're born again, right? And so obviously when Paul says there's neither male nor female, right? It's obvious he doesn't mean there's not literal gender distinctions, obviously, and that you don't have national identity or cultural differences, or that you shouldn't, or that he's suggesting that you shouldn't identify as an American or a Chinese or an Australian or an African, because every tribe, tongue, and nation will be present. Like God likes that sort of diversity. But he also says you shouldn't identify with the world, or you shouldn't identify with the old man. So how can it be both? Well, I would think the idea is that you being a new creation is you identify yourself with God first and foremost. That's who you are. But that doesn't negate the neutral or non-destructive forms that make you distinct from other groups of people. I mean, I don't know how else we could possibly think of a way to look at this, because God's not telling us to all to lose our identity in every sense and to become a bunch of bricks in the wall. I think Solberg if he sees this, he's a musician probably, and so he can appreciate what I'm talking about. But he still wants you to identify with his ways in some sense, obviously, being a new creation, being loving and not being evil. So it's yes and no. It is a biblical concept that you come out of the world and into the family of God, and that's a process of sanctification. But it's also true that you don't have to become a Jew and wear a kippah and copy Jewish people who may or may not believe in Messiah. And many of those things, as long as they're not in conflict with Messiah, are perfectly fine and good to retain as if you're that ethnicity or that culture. So there is a sense it's both. That's my argument. And then the question is, well, what are the things that dictate the new man, which someone who's come into the family of God through the Messiah should take on, having that new man identity in the Messiah? There's something which dictates that which things in our culture we shouldn't continue in, and think some things being okay. So there's a negative and a positive of that. That is, if our cultural practices from where we're from are common to commit adultery, obviously, or sleep around or be promiscuous, which statistically is the case with particular cultures, is unpopular of a fact that may be, not because that's who they are, but because statistics are just facts. And you can relate some of that to cultural nurture of a certain culture, nature, nurture. So it's not about attacking cultures here. It's just about statistics. And we don't bring that in when we become joined to God. Or if some cultural practice has some emphasis on some principle, which is in opposition to what God says, we wouldn't bring that in, even though it's may be something related to our culture or common to our culture. So now the question is, is there something that dictates that? Or is it just every man for himself, whatever he thinks is right? Judge no man, let each be convinced in his own mind. I don't think that has application, even though that is often the case how we operate. So I would have to disagree here on that issue unless he means something different. I suspect he would agree with what I was just saying. But at the same time, I don't think you have to like do every last thing listed in the law of Moses to be part of the family of God. It is a new covenant in that sense. And so let's keep going, and then I'll jump to the thing I wanted to say about the weekly Sabbath in regard to Mr. Solberg's line of reasoning. Dr. Solberg.
Here's a passage from the Torah that makes this distinction really clear. This is from Deuteronomy 10, and God's talking to the Israelites, and he says, "Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers." And who are the fathers he's talking about? Well, verse 22 tells us, your fathers went down to Egypt, 70 persons. So Israel's fathers are those who went down to Egypt. All right. It's talking about Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, and his 12 sons. We see this in Exodus 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, and so on, right? Listing all 12 sons. Okay, now back to Deuteronomy 10, picking up at verse 15. On your fathers, and chose their offspring after them. And the Hebrew word translated as offspring is zerah, which means seed or physical descendant. So Yahweh is talking about genealogy and bloodlines here. Okay. The Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them, you above all peoples, as you are this day. So, you above all peoples. Yahweh chose the descendants of Abraham above all other people. This harkens back to Exodus 19, when at Mount Sinai, God tells the Israelites that you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, right? Of all the peoples on earth, Israel was his treasured possession. And he calls them a holy nation. And in Hebrew, the phrase is L'goy Kadosh. It means a nation that is set apart for God, set apart from all the other nations. Okay.
Now, I could be more thorough in letting him give his explanation, and I will put his, in fact, I'm going to do it right now as I'm talking so I don't forget. This full video is going to be in the description with the Wikipedia article I'm going to use as a reference as well, just for some basic stuff. I'm not sure if you could hear me while I was doing that, but it's in the description. But the Wikipedia article is just something to go off of. I'm not necessarily depending on anything very particular, and it has citations to what I'm going to use, but both of those are in the description of this video. So you should watch this whole video, because I don't want to misrepresent them. And by the way, I admire the disposition, the attitude, the clarity, just the quality of the videos this guy puts out. Never talked to him, so I'm kind of talking to him in this live stream, but hoping for interaction. But I mean that, like, the guy operates well and is the highest quality, so I'm impressed, and I think it's a good example of how to operate in disagreement. Like, I would put him at the top of the list as far as I can tell so far, and I've watched many of the videos. So, and I have disagreements with him, but he's operating how we should. Let's see. I'm going to go to my reference because this is the focus of what I wanted it to be. So based on his argument, I want to ask some questions about the weekly Sabbath based on his kind of reasoning. So I agree that there is a sense that the Israelites were separate. That's clear. But I also agree, which I think he would too, to some degree, with what Hebrew roots are arguing, that it is true that they're calling people out of the world. Israel would be too, in some sense. They were given the oracle of God to take God's ways to the nations to some degree, ultimately through the Messiah. But the question is, so I think it's inevitable making distinctions, right? But I would say any part of the law that God gave to Israel had all the principles and purposes, and you can say the reasons they did certain things at minimum were all things that are appropriate for us to take into account and to operate with. Do I think, I think we have to make a distinction with ceremonial, though, because those things were to represent what Christ would do. And so there is a change in the covenant. The question is to what degree, and what are like universal laws for humanity, and what are the things in particular, perhaps I would argue the terminology of ordinance or dogmas that were against us, or the diverse washings in Hebrews 9 until the time of Reformation. Those two passages suggest to me that there were certain aspects at minimum in the covenant called, which is the law of Moses essentially, that are being referenced there. So all these arguments he's making about the distinctions between what is for Israel proper, in particular in the Old Covenant, what of that should be passed on? Many would say, well, whatever's mentioned in the New Testament, but I would argue that's not quite the right way to go about it either. It doesn't mention bestiality, which I think everyone accepts as something we shouldn't do, or marrying your sister, or a whole list of things that aren't in particularly mentioned. Oh, well, we just know those things are bad. Well, yeah, kind of. But is it a sin against God? How do you know if it's a sin against God, etc.? So I want to focus in on the weekly Sabbath. If it's true that these verses that are specifically making a distinction between the foreigner and the native born, what does the Ten Commandments say about in the weekly Sabbath? It says, everyone is afforded to keep the Sabbath as something, as a gift. Jesus said, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. It's an argument. It should be an argument for his deity. I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I made it for man, not man for it. Now, someone says, well, he's not arguing humanity versus the Jews there. So the humans there could just be made it for the Jews, but he didn't make it for the Jews. It's a reference to creation. So the anthropos that's there in the Greek text, made for man, that's a general term for mankind. Now, in a context of just talking to the Jews, it could be that you interpret it as humanity, like with a distinction, that is the covenant people. But because of that's a reference to his deity or him being the one who made the Sabbath, that's a callback to Genesis, which is the story of making mankind proper. So to me, the anthropos there should be humanity without a distinction. You have to import the distinction of humanity there being a subgroup of, say, those under the Mosaic covenant. After all, he made the Sabbath holy as a day in creation. That's probably why it's within the moral commands in the Ten Commandments in its codification for the Sinai covenant and Exodus 20. So we don't need a command, just like we don't need one for murder before Exodus to know that it's certainly the Sabbath, like murder and the other moral commands in the Ten Commandments, existed before Exodus. Now here's the argument I wanted to make to further that. Well, we don't see a command, so it wasn't a command, so it wasn't a sin to not keep the Sabbath. We don't see Abraham keeping the Sabbath. It doesn't mention it. It's not, but that would be an argument from silence. And I know Dr. Solberg understands that. So I'm going to point to, well, we just can't be sure. And it's not necessarily something innate, although you could argue it is. We see circadian cycles in the created order, which is very interesting. So here's another question. What is the origin of the Sabbath really? Because a lot of people who are, say, old earth creationists who have studied this, they're going to argue like what I'm about to show. And this is probably some of the reasons why they argue this, but that it's a polemic. That is, the 7-day week and the lunar notions in the calendar of the lunisolar calendar were developed in the exilic period in Babylon. Now, if that's true, that means the whole creation story has doesn't have much literal content, and that the 7-day week is incidental. But that seems to fly in the face of the seriousness of penalties under the covenant that God makes and the claims he makes about its origin. Now let's take a look at this article. I think if you're obliged, once you get past just the general secular arguments about history and archaeology and regarding the origins of the 7-day week, if you are a believer dedicated to, and I know Solberg is, then this seems like an issue, because how are you going to make sense of this? So ancient Near East regarding the history of the 7-day week. The earliest evidence of astronomical significance of a 7-day period is connected to Gudea, the priest king of Lagash in Sumer, about 2100 BC, who built a 7-room temple, which he dedicated with a 7-day festival. Okay, so we have this. Now, it goes on to argue that counting from the new moon, the Babylonians celebrated every 7th, basically a lunar Sabbatarian position, right? The Babylonians celebrated the 7th, the 14th, and the 21st and the 28th as holy days, also called evil days, meaning inauspicious for certain activities. So meaning they had prohibitions for the 7th day, which was a 7-day cycle of sorts, right? That they called holy the 7th day. Or at least they made the 28th day a rest day, it was called, not a common day, okay? So some 1600 years before Moses writes, assuming Moses wrote in 1400s, right? Take a conservative approach, which I do, that the Exodus is in the 1400s BC, which would be when he would write the Pentateuch, or however you look at that, put it together, which becomes scripture, right? The 5 books of Moses. We have 7-day cycles being practiced in the earliest cultures. So like it goes on to say, I'll try to make this quick and wrap it up here, but they had a form of a lunar calendar and a 7-day cycle way before, and it's outside of the Hebrews culture. People are practicing. Now, some say the Jews adapted this and adopted it because it says here, apparently, a continuous 7-day cycle that runs throughout history without reference to the phases of the moon, like the lunar Sabbatarians would argue, or that the Babylonians were doing. They added intercalary days. It wasn't just a continuous 7-day cycle, according to this. But I've also read that in 2200, it's on the walls of Babylon that they had a 7-day week, and they called the Seventh Day Sabbath. I think that mentions it here. So, seems to me, if we believe that the 7-day cycle has its origins in the creation by God, who claims as much and offers very harsh penalties under the covenant for those who break it. He says in Exodus 16, how long will you break my Sabbaths, as though they have existed before the manna situation comes, where he tells them to gather manna and double on Friday so they don't gather any on the Sabbath day. Well, we know that Genesis says the Sabbath day is holy because God created it at the beginning and then rested, he ceased, verb, that day. Doesn't have the noun there for Sabbath. But putting this all together, so it kind of renders the idea that there's no command or that it's used in the verb form is kind of irrelevant, because we see that in the world, hundreds and hundreds of, or at least 700, if not, so probably more, obviously, this is all we have evidence for. There was other cultures practicing a 7-day week with a day in it that where they ceased from labor, or that they didn't perform certain activities, or they called it a kind of rest day. 700 years before Moses wrote. I don't see how you get around the idea that although there may not be a command like murder or adultery before Exodus, they knew those things were a sin, and we have in scripture those examples. So now the question is, where there is no law, there is no sin. So we have to either say, there's only a few options if we're going to keep scripture consistent with itself. Either it's being anachronistically written back into the text before Exodus, which kind of falsifies what the text says. They are sins according to Joseph, according to God, when Abel murders his brother. And if it's true that there is no law where there is no, or there's no sin where there is no law, then we have to conclude that there is a law before Exodus. And what should we consider in that law? Well, The Sabbath was declared and made holy the seventh day and that day in the week, although it doesn't use the term Sabbath noun. It uses a form of it in the verb form, and it applies it to a day on a 7-day cycle. If that is the case, and then we see that there's 7 versions of the 7-day cycle with a rest day, a special day called Sabbatu in the Babylonian, 700 years before Moses. Can we really say that they didn't know that the 7th day was holy from creation? I say no. The only other answer would be that the Sabbath is a polemic developed out of the Babylonian period and the exile. That seems very problematic considering the claims Scripture makes God makes in Scripture and the penalties associated with it because of its sanctity according to God for the reasons he gives. Therefore, the Sabbath is holy, and it was made for mankind, no distinction. And we know it existed in the world well before the Exodus, as we see polluted versions in the Babylonian culture and other cultures. And I could give more references for that. It's not really doubted. And because we know the 7-day cycle really has no astronomical connection, like all the other all the other increments we have, like days and months, moon, based on the moon or based on the rising and evening and morning. And the seasonal cycle for years, they or the other cultures had a version of it. Now, I think God made it. And if that's true, then it existed from the beginning. And it was holy from the beginning because God ceased. He says as much. And the last thing I'll say regarding the argument I presented from Dr. Solberg would be, okay, there's specifics in the text that make distinctions between what's for the foreigner and what's for the native born and what's for the foreigner. Not only have we seen that the Sabbath was made at the beginning for mankind and was made holy by God himself from the very first 7-day cycle, but we read in the commandment itself that it is afforded to even the foreigner within your gate, even to the beast of burden. So again, in conclusion, I argue based on Mr. Solberg's principles laid out, making distinctions for what is appropriate for the new covenant believer in Messiah, that it's different from the Sinai covenant. The Sabbath is not to be excluded from the new covenant.